Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion. Our title today is How Leading Families Make Critical Ownership Decisions. We're going to do a little bit of housekeeping, and then we will dive into what I think will be a really dynamic conversation. For those of you who are participating live with us today, your participation, you have a control panel at the side of your screen that you can open and close using the orange arrow. You can choose your mic and speakers to join the audio or dial in by telephone if you prefer. And you can submit questions and comments at any time via the questions panel. We have allocated some time at the end of today's discussion for that. So we encourage you to get your questions in early as things occur to you as we go through the discussion. We'll be happy to pull from those either in the moment or at the end of the session so that we can answer the things that are most relevant to you. Today's presentation is also being recorded. You will get a recording of this via email within 48 hours. If you haven't received it yet, please allocate that 48 hours for that to be delivered to you. And then if you don't receive it, by all means, follow up. We're happy to provide it. You'll also receive a follow-up email with additional materials, articles, readings, things that you can use to extend your learning on this topic, and also information about our three fantastic presenters today and their the work that they've done that has cultivated this conversation. Also, before we get started, just to note, we value confidentiality. So as we're sharing cases and anecdotes from families, those have been either approved to be shared from the family that we've talked about, that we're talking about, but most often those are sanitized so that we can describe the situation while maintaining the confidentiality of people involved. And also, this is an educational dialogue. So some of the things we talk about may pertain to you. We encourage you to engage with your own advisors or to follow up offline for more guidance on your particular situation. This, I hope, will inspire some great thinking from you and your family. And you have to put all of this into the context of what is the best for your family situation. And with that, we're going to turn off the slides and focus on a great conversation with three of my fantastic colleagues. Let's go ahead and introduce my guests for today. All of these folks are members of the FBCG team, and the impetus for this conversation is that they've all written pieces in the last couple of months about the things that owners most need to consider. So we'll start by saying some hellos. David Karofsky, welcome, David.
Hi, Christy. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you today.
Josh Nacht. Hi, Josh.
Hello, everyone. Hi.
And Martha Sullivan.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to talk with you all today.
And we have some good geographic representation. David's based in Boston, Josh is in Colorado, Martha is in Wisconsin, I'm based in Chicago, so we've hit, I think, most of the time zones in that trade-off. But particularly the reason that this group is here today is because of the work that they've been doing recently in thinking about ownership issues. So David and Josh recently wrote an article called Selling for Success. Sometimes the best thing for the family is letting go. And that article explored why families might choose to sell, the pros and cons, and the factors that go into that. Martha also did a great case study article recently called Putting Ownership Alignment into Practice, the Sanders Family Dilemma. And that also walked through some of the critical ownership topics that are under consideration. And as we looked at those two pieces, it really sort of kicked off an opportunity today to talk more about ownership decisions, with a recognition that family enterprise owners are responsible for some of the most impactful decisions for the enterprise. And the better that they are at making decisions together, the better alignment, the better progress, the better we can seize opportunities. Challenges with decision making can slow things down. You can miss opportunities, can waste resources. And so we're going to talk over the next hour about the kinds of conversations that families have in making these critical decisions. We're going to touch on a few different areas. We'll look at this as kind of a survey course of some of these ownership decisions. We're certainly going to share some detail and some examples, but if you are interested in any of these areas, there will be an opportunity in the post survey to ask for, to express interest in more information. We'll send some more resources, and there's more learning to do, certainly beyond our conversation today. So let's go ahead and get started. Our opening question, and I'll pose this to Josh. We sometimes say that the number of decisions that owners need to make are relatively small, but those decisions have a relatively big impact on the business. So what are the core decisions that owners really need to be focused on?
Yeah, this is a great question, Christy, and welcome everybody. We like to see owners really focusing in on 5 main areas, and these areas that I go through are going to form the basis of the webinar today as we talk about each one. And those are the vision for the future of the business and the future of the family. Some financial metrics. We use an acronym called GRIPL, which is growth, risk, profitability, and liquidity. And those are some general big picture financial metrics for the company that the owners can set. The next decision is the structure of the board. Who should serve on the board of directors for the company, both family members and independent members. The fourth is, should we continue to hold on to this business and why? Or might we consider selling the business and why? That's something that Christy mentioned we've written some articles on, and clearly that's a pretty major decision. But one that a lot of families will encounter at different points in their life cycle. And then the last is ownership transition. How is ownership transitioned from one generation to the next? What are the limits or the parameters on that, and what are the rights that come with ownership? And I'd like to reiterate something that Christy said, and as we're speaking today, really consider how these decisions and how we're speaking about these decisions apply to you and your unique situation. These 5 topics are something that we've seen clients encounter in our experience. They're relatively common decisions for people to encounter, but every family is going to encounter them in their own unique ways. So really take what we're saying and think of your unique context, the people involved, the agreements that you already have in place, and just how this applies to you. So I'm going to start with vision. And in a founder-led company, and that is usually the first generation, not always, sometimes subsequent generations can end up back at an entrepreneurial mindset, but for purposes of this conversation, we'll really start with a founder-led company in the first generation. And that vision is generally limited to 1 or 2 people, right? It's the founder of the company. Oftentimes a spouse is involved. They see a need for something in the marketplace. They create a company, they create a service that's unique. And as it grows, they are then forced to say, okay, what is the vision? What do I want with this? What could this company be? And that's generally a very small individual, or like it said, with a spouse who's creating that vision as they start to talk about it. What happens then is we move to the sibling generation, which is generally the 2nd generation, cousins at the 3rd generation and beyond. The vision starts to need to become co-created. It's not just the product of one person, it's the product of a group. And so, this really raises the question, how do families build a shared vision? And how do we articulate that vision and help families articulate that vision? So it's really about addressing this core topic. What do you want? What do you want for the future of the business? What do you want for the future of the family? Then the family ownership group. The ways that we help families with this now, and this is where I think it's important to recognize that different families need different facilitation and different processes. Different families have different capabilities, different ways of speaking together, and so every family will approach visioning in a slightly different manner. Some families work really well with, kind of dreaming. What is your highest hopes for the business? Let's write those down. Let's do some big picture visioning without limits, and then we can distill those back down into something that's realistic. Some families work well with scenario evaluation. We can put out different scenarios for the future and then say, which one do you want and why? Why do you want that? Because that's an important piece of what what is behind a vision, and distilling statements down into something that everybody can say, yeah, that works for me. I can get behind that, and it's something that's really compelling to me. When we're looking at vision, it's important to remember that many families have to balance tradition and evolution, right? A third generation family isn't usually coming up with a vision from scratch. They're building on what has been built in the first generation, the second generation, and then they have to look ahead and say, for our generation, what is our vision? And so that's a balancing of tradition and evolution. But we see a lot of visions do need to be refreshed or at least affirmed over time. For a lot of vision work, we really advocate a consensus-based approach where everybody has a chance to have their voices heard, to weigh in on the vision. And then all those perspectives are taken into account into something that everybody can live with. And when we say consensus, that's really what we mean is everybody can say, okay, I can live with that. I had a chance to have my input on it. Maybe I don't agree with every little piece, but it was a fair process for how to get there. And that's something I'll speak about a little bit later too. We see vision statements being the most effective when they're really clear and succinct. And a clear, succinct statement that is compelling and inspiring is something that a family can really move forward with. Your statement may never be perfect, and that's okay. But when it is inspiring and everybody can say, yeah, that's something I can get behind, it's probably good enough to move forward with. And then the last piece about vision is that when we're speaking about a vision, that oftentimes a lot of families will break this down into two statements or two parts of a statement. What is the vision for the business? What is the vision for the family, the ownership group, and the family enterprise as being part of that, owning that business? And we really view those as mutually supportive, and they really need to be aligned. Obviously, you can see we can't have vision statements that are going two different directions. And this is where the family's vision statement and the business vision statement being aligned bring real strength to each of those systems.
Thank you, Josh. I think one of the things that you've hit on that's really important is some of these facilitation opportunities are create a voice for the family, because in the founding generation, it may be that we're more used to listening to the vision of the founder, but as you move into other generations, you need to figure out ways to sort of cultivate that conversation and turn it into something that's meaningful and usable and people can really own.
Yeah, and that can be an interesting opportunity and challenge for families as they balance different voices, they balance different generations, different cultures. Hopefully there's good values alignment, but balancing all of those different perspectives can produce some really interesting and meaningful statements. It can also provide a challenge for families, as there might be some hopefully healthy tension between different people's perspectives, but one that we can reconcile through facilitation and taking the time to really invest the energy in creating a meaningful statement.
Perfect. So Josh, you did a great job of outlining our first area, which is vision. We'll move on to the next area, which is owner's expectation for business performance. And Martha, I'd love for you to lead us off on this one. At FBCG, we often work with families to help define owners' expectations in terms of the 4 key metrics with which Josh started us to understand: growth, risk, profitability, and liquidity, which we sometimes call GRIPL. The key conversations that we are having there can't have everything. So there's some sort of tension and trade-offs between, more growth, more liquidity, more profitability, So why is clarity here valuable, and how do owners find common ground?
That is a super, super question, because it's in some ways it feels like a chicken and the egg some days in terms of clarity versus alignment. Clarity is actually what breeds the understanding, and from the understanding you can move towards alignment. When we see families wrestling with a situation, or within the family they're feeling tension, or they're dealing with conflict, it usually points to a lack of alignment in what people want, what people need. And that's where those trade-offs come in. One person might be at a stage in their life where growth is, oh, that's what we got to go for it. And then there's, you know, the other member of the family going, time out, not into growth. It feels too risky. I need more liquidity out of the business. So there is this tension and trade-off. And without the clarity of individuals' needs and wants and what the needs are of the business as well, it can snowball ultimately. And so that common ground does start in many ways with what Josh was talking about. Having a shared vision for the family, having a shared vision for the ownership and the business enterprise itself, and then building off of that. And I think it's very often I see our families rushing to go to set the business metrics. You know, what is that year-over-year % of growth we want in sales, or what's that right balance of risk in terms of our debt to equity ratio, or what is our dividend and distribution policy for liquidity. And it's very tempting to go directly to the business, but in our experience, it actually starts with the individual. Because what I need and what my phase of life is different than what David needs and what David's phase of life is, or Josh, or anyone else in your family group. And you need to understand your own perspectives, and then through a facilitated process, be in a position to share that and then create this understanding and common ground with your family members to come to defining what that means and how that then translates into the business metrics. The last thing I would say is that this is not a one and done exercise. While the vision maybe is a longer term view, you need to be refreshing these things on a regular basis in terms of what does that mean in terms of our GRIPL model or our GRIPL statement. And when I say regularly, I'm annually, because things change, life circumstances change, business needs and opportunities change. So a lot of really cool things come out of using the GRIPL framework in building alignment, but you need to be vigilant about doing it as well.
Christy, if I can add in, I think the GRIPL process or the GRIPL method that we use it's very common. We use it in a lot of ownership type consulting engagements. And it's one of the things that Martha's really talking about in terms of creating that strategic vision around those 4 key areas is one of the most useful tools. The other piece that GRIPL really helps with is creating alignment among the ownership group. And it is, in our work, we're finding that when we have an aligned ownership group, particularly when you get into the second, third generations, right? As the first generation, as Josh talked to, it's generally 1 or 2 people. As you start to get into second, third, fourth, you're going to get a diverse set of owners. And to be able to use GRIPL as an alignment tool for that entire ownership group can be very, very powerful.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding that, David.
Yeah.
And Martha, you mentioned the importance of updating things, and it strikes me that this is a great tool for a two-way conversation with management. So in the last few years, we've seen a great deal of change in the business landscape, right? It's been dynamic, to say the least. And so that sort of regular updating of ownership expectations gives updated information to management on terms of their expectations. And I expect that it then allows management to come back to ownership with new information on what they're seeing in the business landscape and how that might impact owner expectations.
Absolutely. There is a synergy between really all 3 groups, the family, the shareholder group, and the executive leadership of the company, so that there's transparency. People understand what the process is and able to share information and updates about, okay, well, you know, we just had to close down because of the pandemic or X, Y, or Z. What does that mean? How are we pivoting? And what does that mean for our growth goals or our debt needs or whatever? So it's absolutely a dialogue across the enterprise. It's not just one little group huddling and then, being disappointed when nobody else knows what they're supposed to do.
Perfect. So our next area that we're going to explore, critical decision area, is board governance. And David, you'll kick us off on this one, I think. As the business progresses to a stage where the owners and leaders may not all be the same people, owners may need to get clear on a corporate governance structure. In recent years, we've seen a lot of family businesses formalizing and investing in a board of directors, both for strategic insight as well as management oversight. So what do you see is prompting owners to formalize that governance structure, and how does it serve what the owners want to achieve?
So there's really kind of four key areas that may prompt an ownership group to start thinking about evolving their board structure. Every company has a board. Sometimes it's a paper board, and sometimes it's a real performing board. When you're kind of in that G1 framework, it tends to be more of a paper board. It's owner driven. It's the founder. It's that core family that's really making all the decisions from really the top all the way down in terms of just trying to get that company launched. What we have found is as that family business evolves into G2, G3, G3, and into G4, that's when a couple of things are happening. One, you're getting a more complex ownership group. So instead of 1 to 2 owners, you're now having 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm working with a G7 group that has 35 owners. So it's very complex. Having a governance structure that kind of sits in between ownership and management can be really, really helpful from a structural standpoint. So that's kind of one key point. 2, your business is evolving, and it's not what it was when it started 30 years ago or whatever it might be. It's more complex. It's gone through its stages of growth and stabilization, and then probably growth again. So using a board at that point with outside independent people can really help stabilize and also help take that business to the next level, because now you've got a set of independent advisors giving thoughts and advice on the business itself. The other piece that you want to think about is you're going to get into more formalized decision making. When you get into a larger ownership group, not all the owners are going to have the same level of involvement. You may have some operating owners that are really in there day to day. You're going to have more passive owners that are more just looking for the investment or looking for a return on the investment, but they're not in the day-to-day operations of the business. And so when you get a diversified set of owners, having one core group in the form of a board of directors that's governing the business and sits between, as I said earlier, helps them make better decisions and more formalized decisions. The one kind of fear that family businesses often have with a board is, I'm going to lose control, the board's going to take over control. And it's absolutely not true, because the board, the ownership group still gets to vote the board. And so you still get to decide who's going to sit on that board. Whether it's family members or independents, you get to choose that structure. And so you'll never really fully lose control. And so I don't want that to really be a fear. Frankly, it's an opportunity that we see it. And actually, there's research out there that supports that boards of directors tend to improve the sustainability of a family business, that and strategic planning. And so they're really closely tied together. And so now you get an opportunity to seek outside advisors to come in and sit and build a performing board. In order to do that, you got to really understand that the board of directors, they're a fiduciary, and they have a fiduciary responsibility to the entire ownership group, not just the owners that are working in the business. They work for the entire ownership group, and particularly the voting members of an ownership group that get to vote who sits on the board. They often, as I said earlier, they're that conduit. They sit in the middle between an ownership group and management. And so they can drive the owner's vision down into management, but they get to hold management accountable versus management being accountable to 35 shareholders independently. It creates a little bit more consolidation, which creates more focus for the board and for the ownership group. You want to, when you're looking at a board of directors, you want to understand who should sit on the board and who shouldn't sit on the board. It's not, we will never sit on the boards of our clients. In fact, it's one of our core principles. We don't believe in that. You're already paying us to be your advisors. We believe that other advisors, lawyers, attorneys, or lawyers and attorneys are the same, accountants, financial advisors, they're not the ones who should be sitting on your board. You're already paying them, and you're using them in a different advisory capacity. So you want to go look at the needs of the business, the needs of the ownership group, and start to kind of think about who should sit on the board, and basically based on your vision, based on GRIPL, what are we trying to achieve here, and who should we put on the board to best serve those needs of the business and the family together. And ideally, you want to put together a really talented group of individuals to advise that business.
Yeah, I want to jump in here for just a second and build on what you're saying there, David, because I think you're making a distinction that families, as they're stepping into their first board of directors or considering a board of directors, families can baby step into that. You can start with just an advisory board. You don't have to immediately go to the fiduciary responsibilities that you're describing, David. It is truly bringing in some independent members of your advisory board and using them as a sounding board, as a resource for industry knowledge or things of that nature. And then as you get comfortable with that process, you can step into the fiduciary level of a board of directors where there is that voting responsibility and the hiring, firing of the president and all of those aspects. So you can baby step into that. And I think the other thing you were alluding to is the need, the really healthy exercise of doing a gap analysis of what talent do we need, do we want to bring to our board. Maybe we have a gap in our industry knowledge, or maybe we need somebody with more financial acumen. We don't want our accountant, but we want to know somebody that can help us and help the leadership team grow in this area and become more sophisticated, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really strong points there.
Yeah.
And I'll just add, I think this can be a pretty weighty decision for the family members to make, right? This is a major decision, and hiring specific talent for the board really requires looking ahead. Where is the business going? What will the business need in the future? Is that merger and acquisition? Is it strategic thinking? Is it somebody with just a lot of governance experience who can help us on the board? And this is an area where I think some families are well equipped to make those type of decisions, and other families are going to need a little bit more facilitation and help and just some assistance in making these decisions. But like many decisions, the more the family does it, the easier it's going to be. And once the board is up and running, the board can also say, hey, we think somebody like this would be helpful, and the family can be a really helpful partner in making those decisions about who sits on the board.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
One of the things that strikes me is, Martha, I liked your comments about baby steps. The next section we're going to talk about is perhaps a more time-sensitive, discrete decision. But some of these things about vision and GRIPL and even board governance, there are things that an ownership group can do to start to move in the direction of greater clarity and to start practicing talking about vision, talking about expectations. And that can help build muscles that as these larger, more concrete decisions come about, not only do you as an ownership group have a stronger sense of direction and alignment about what you want that you can build off of, but also you're more in practice of having those conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the next section we're going to talk about is the decision to sell or hold the business. So this is definitely a weightier, more concrete decision. And Martha, I'm going to start by posing this to you. In the current market, there's been a lot of capital. There have been a lot of unsolicited offers of interest. And there are other things that will prompt families to consider whether they want to keep or sell the business. So what are some of the situations that prompt families to wrangle with this? And what are the factors that you see swaying decisions in one direction or another?
Yeah, Christy, we see this a lot, and we help facilitate this conversation for our families a lot, because there are those unsolicited offers coming up, but there are these other scenarios that really sometimes, put the family back in their seats and like, oh my goodness, we have to address this. It could be the health crisis of an owner, or the loss of an owner. I'm working with the family right now that sudden loss has them speculating, do we hold or do we keep it? There can be just a different phase of life in terms of operating owners that want to step back and want to retire, or a greater need for liquidity as they go into retirement. All these things can bubble up really at any time. And to your earlier point, that's one of the reasons why flexing these muscles and having an enterprise that's always ready for prime time and always driving value is really, really critical to the overall preparedness. But so some of the factors that we see that drive family enterprises to hold the course and continue to hold the company, not sell it, really boil down to legacy. There's a lot of emotion coming to a decision to sell, and as well as a lot of emotion coming to hold. And there's the interest on the next generation's part to continue owning the enterprise itself. And the next generation wants to be engaged. They have an appetite for it, to hold on to it. It also may not be the right time in the market. While some companies are getting unsolicited offers, there may be other things that need to happen within that company to get it ready for sale. And while we might want to get out from under it, it may not deliver the value that we ultimately want out of it. So we have work to do. So that can also drive a hold strategy. Flipping over to what's going to drive a sale, obviously an untimely or unanticipated event it can prompt that, but very often we'll also see families where the next generation doesn't have an interest or doesn't necessarily have the competencies to run the business in a way that can provide the leading and exiting generation the financial security that they need in their next adventure in their lives. There may just be shifting priorities and interests on the part of the family. We loved being a buggy whip company, but now we're interested in this new technology and want to go in that. So that can drive a sale strategy. And there may be market opportunities. On the flip side of not being ready for prime time, you may look at your industry, look at the market opportunity and say, you know what, we're kicking tail and we're naming names. Now is the time to sell. We've got a great trend line. We've got a great story to tell. It's time to harvest this asset. So ultimately, I think, we very often frame this question and this dilemma around challenging families to answer the question, why? Why do we own this business? What is it doing for our families? What is it doing for us as shareholders? How is it fulfilling our vision and our purpose of the enterprise? If the answer is ultimately to sell, I think Josh and David also, we strongly encourage families to look at all their options. Look at, does an ESOP fit? Does an industry player fit? What about private equity? What about selling to key management? Look under all of those rocks so you have choices and can make the decision that fits your family the best. And then make sure you're following a disciplined process and communicating through that process. So people don't start making assumptions and getting nervous because they don't know what's going on and then feel uncomfortable with that. So David, Josh, I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to add.
The one piece I would add in, and I think Josh probably has a couple of comments as well, is in my experience where family business sales do not succeed kind of at the 11th hour is when the family is not is kind of, again, in agreement and alignment as to what the objectives are, you know, whether it's price, terms, whatever, right? And those are just two. I mean, it's often it's the emotional, I can't let go of this business. Do I trust who's buying it? You know, it's a major emotional decision because it's a legacy. And like you know, you said at the end, communicate. And I cannot stress that enough, is that when you are in a sales situation, that the entire ownership group is just in lockstep with what's the goal here? What is it that we're really trying to achieve? And are we all feeling good about the decision to sell the business and achieve that goal? You got to talk.
Well, and as you think about it, the Sanders case in the article that Christy was mentioning earlier, it tied back to that vision. It ties back to Gripple and having your shared understanding of what's important and where are your tolerances at. So it's amazing. It all kind of fits together in one big happy
Sure
puzzle.
does.
Josh, did you have a note to add?
Well, I was just going to reiterate that this is one of the most major decisions a family can make, and it's going to be very emotional. So I think taking that into account, and it is an area where a board of directors can help the family, you know, evaluate their options and make decisions possible. The board can't make that decision for the family generally, but this is something where the board can assist in the process and can make recommendations and help the family arrive at those decision points. But it's not easy. This is, I think, in our experience, one of the most emotional decisions that a family can make.
Yeah.
And it's okay. I think that the last piece that I'll say on this is sometimes families need to give themselves permission to sell the business. It's okay if that is the right decision for the family. Not there, it's an evolution, and the business is an asset. That is its purpose ultimately, in the coldest terms, is to serve the family. And it may be at a point where it's not serving it anymore. So it's okay to redeploy those assets.
Yeah, definitely.
And Martha, you hit a little bit in your earlier comments about you know, moving from the buggy whip business, for instance, to new interests. And as you think about, you know, redeployment, we're seeing a lot of families who are sort of characterizing themselves as entrepreneurial families, and they may no longer be in their legacy business, but this transition allows them to think of new ways to be entrepreneurial together. So it can be a step in a new stage in the family story, and sometimes, you know, looking forward to something can help to manage the emotions of that transition.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing a lot of families set up family foundations or family offices. And those are vehicles that allow the family to continue to work on something together without it necessarily being that specific operating business. So the selling of one asset doesn't preclude you from being able to work together. It's just moving into a new chapter and a new adventure for the family enterprise.
All right, well, we're going to move on to our next chapter, with the next topic being around ownership transition. And David, I'm going to pose this one to you. For families that are committed to staying in business together, the question of ownership transition is obviously a really critical one. So what are the few questions that you think owner groups need to address as they're planning an ownership transition?
So, ownership transition, and particularly now, if you think kind of where we are in the evolution of family businesses, where we are today sociologically in our generational shifts, we're in the middle of the largest transition of assets, both cash, investments, as well as operating businesses that we've ever been in the world, in our life cycle. And so, when you look at that, there are a tremendous amount of family businesses that are in some form of transition, be it leadership and ownership that's going on right now. From an ownership perspective, there are really kind of 4 key areas, and there's many, but I'm going to key in on 4 today that we want to be thinking about when you're looking at ownership transition. The first being financial, the second being control, the third being readiness, and the fourth being what types of mechanisms do we use. So when you look at financial and what are we thinking about from a financial standpoint with respect to ownership transition, you want to look at equity in the business. How are we passing equity down to the next generation? Who is even going to get equity, and what decisions? Is it kind of fair and equal in the family, and each child of the next generation is going to get an equal ownership whether you work in the business or not? That might be. There's no right or wrong answer. The right answer is the answer that's going to work for your family, which is going to be different from other families, first and foremost. Some families may look at those working in the business are going to get the equity, and those who are not in the business, we will take care of them with other assets that might be outside of the family business. So there are different options. So you want to look at what's the equity situation. Also, when you look at equity and financial, what's the current state of the existing ownership group? Do they need to sell the business down to the next generation to pull cash out to help fund their retirement, for example? So what's their own financial position? So you really want to know, if you're an owner at this point, you want to understand what's your financial situation and what's your long-term plan financially as you start to exit the business and exit ownership. And that factors right into wealth planning, estate planning, taxes. There's a lot of mechanisms, and again, we're not attorneys, but there are lots of mechanisms and thoughts that you can put in place from a financial perspective to help protect that asset. You can pass it down in a generation skipping type trust, for example. There's lots of different things that can be done to protect the financial interests of the family and the business. You want to also look at what's the feasibility of passing down this business. How are we going to do it? Are we going to sell it? Do we gift it? What's the valuation? Is it at market rate? Is it is it more kind of just what's the value of the business in terms of the assets itself? So you want to look at how are we going to pass it down from a financial perspective. The other thing financially, the last thing you want to think about is, what about the distributions to the owners? Not every family business gives distributions, but many do. Well, is the business worth more in terms of the form of distributions, or is it worth more in the terms of selling it down to the next generation? So how do you take into consideration the use of distributions and the impact of cash flow with respect to the generations that may be selling the business or transitioning ownership? The next piece is control. When we pass the business, well, who has control now? And is it the leading generation that has had control for the last 25 years? And all of a sudden, are you ready to give up control to the next generation? And if you pass, obviously, 100% of ownership, you're giving up that control. There's other ways. Do you pass a minority interest to the next generation so you're retaining majority control of the business so you still have control? Do you split the shares in terms of equity and voting shares, and you can move the equity shares out of your estate down to the next generation, but you retain the voting control so that you can still make decisions operationally in the business, vote the board, whatever it might be in terms of the control of the business. So if you're ready to transition, you got to look at, are you actually ready to give up control of the business, and what does that mean? Control also, when you look at voting shares, how do you vote your shares? Are you voting it by percentage of ownership? If you have 4 kids and you pass down 25%, each kid gets 25% of the vote. Or are you passing it, or is voting control going to be one vote, one head? So per person. So you may have a multi-distributed family enterprise with 35 shareholders, which are going to get a very distributed percentage-wise, but you don't vote percent of your owner, one head, one vote, everybody's equal. So you got to take these things into consideration as to what's in the best interest of the business when looking at the transition of ownership from a decision-making process as well as control. The third thing is readiness. Where are you in the stage of the business? Is the business ready for an ownership transition? Are you in heavy growth mode and transition right now might not make the most sense? Are you more in a steady state and it's all of a sudden the next generation, they've been there for 10 or 15 years, they're now leading the company, and now the company is well positioned to actually, let's pass the ownership piece down. When I look at that, the one thing I want to add in is don't confuse leadership from ownership. They're two separate things. You can pass leadership in terms of who runs the business day to day and still retain ownership. They don't have to go at the same time. So you can separate those two pieces. From a readiness, is the next generation ready? Have you educated them in what it is to be a contributing, healthy shareholder? And what type of shareholder are they going to be? There's different types. Are they going to be a passive shareholder because they're not working in the business? Are they going to be an operating shareholder because they might be the CEO or part of the management team or working in the business? So understanding that as you get down the generations and you get into a distributed ownership model, you're going to get different types of owners. And so educating the ownership group in terms of what's their role and responsibility as an owner is really important to be thinking about as you go through this transition. Looking at governance, what's the structure of the business? This is where boards, I think, can be really helpful in a time of ownership transition to start to implement a board structure. The timing can really work very, very well between those two pieces because you're passing ownership, you're bringing on a board, the board's there to support that now larger ownership group. And so the two can tick and tie really well with each other. The final thing you got to look at is family dynamics. What's the relationships among the family members? Do the shareholders get along? Is there a risk that we've got some family challenges, which every family in the world has them, whether you admit or not? Every family's got challenges in different shapes and sizes. Is the ownership group ready from a family dynamic standpoint to be able to handle some of the challenges of what ownership might bring to the table? So that's the readiness piece. And finally, mechanisms. How do we pass ownership? What's your existing shareholder agreement say? Do you have a shareholder agreement? Do we now need to rewrite one because all of a sudden we're going from 2 owners to 5 owners, from 5 owners to 15 or 20 owners? What does the shareholder agreement allow for? What's a buy-sell agreement? Who can you sell shares to? Does it go bloodline only? Can you sell to an outside party, which is probably unlikely? Is the business going to be forced to buy shares back if somebody doesn't want to be an owner? So you got to think of what are the different models that the family wants to consider when looking at ownership transition. So those are the 4 key areas: financial, control, readiness, and what type of mechanism are you going to use to actually pass ownership down.
Thank you, David. That's a fantastic survey course of the question of ownership transition. Sometimes we joke that any one of those bullet points could have been a full discussion of its own. So hopefully people are walking away with some good questions that they can continue to follow up with on that.
Yeah.
We're gonna close our discussion with a little bit of review, and Josh, maybe you can just touch on a couple of things. We note in our work, and I think it's been a theme as we've gone through this discussion, that decision making is often in the process, right? So how do we create conditions for good decision making with a lot of different people who have a lot of different experiences and different perspectives and point of views? Josh, can you share just a couple of tips that you would like for people to walk away with on good ownership decision making?
Yeah, and I think these, when David was speaking, I was thinking for myself, wow, if I was involved in a company, I'd be overwhelmed right now. Thinking about, wow, these are really major decisions. I don't know how we would do that. I don't know how we would do that with our family or with my family. And in the families that I've worked with and that we've worked with that are most successful in this process, they've really established something that we like to call fair process guidelines. They, in a proactive way, And obviously they're making decisions along the way, but in a proactive way, they say, let's set out some guidelines for how we make decisions in a way that's fair and feels good to everybody. So these are some clear agreements on who's involved and in what way. And sometimes these fair process guidelines, you have to think of these applying to any decision, sometimes small decisions up to some of the really important decisions we're talking here. And there are things like, we take everybody's voice into account. Everybody's voice matters, and we listen to each other. We don't blow off certain people we disagree with, or, Aunt Linda, just because she's always has the contrarian view. She has a contrarian view for a reason. We take everybody's voice into account. Before we make a decision, we'll go around and hear from everybody. I think we've all been in rooms where certain people hide or don't speak up as much for various reasons. But they may have a perspective that's really valuable, and we're going to make sure we hear from everybody first. We take sufficient time to talk about a topic, and we know when to move on. We've all been in meetings when things have gotten belabored, so we want to take enough time. We know when to move on, and we're going to give somebody in the meeting the authority, the leadership, to be able to help us move past those points. We're clear when we're discussing something or when we actually may need to make a decision, and we're going to know that before we walk into the room. Another agreement is we'll have all the information we need ahead of time, and we'll all come prepared. I think all of us have experienced where we don't get the meeting information with enough time to review it before the meeting, and that doesn't lead to very effective meetings. It also doesn't feel very good, because then people feel like, well, maybe I'm not valued because I didn't get the information. I can't really weigh in and make an effective decision. And there's no surprises. That's another, kind of fair process guideline. We know what we're doing in the meeting beforehand. Showing up to a meeting and having somebody say, hey, we need to make this major decision by the end of this meeting, that's not a very effective way to do things. So these are some general guidelines. You can think in your own family, what guidelines might you have? What of these guidelines might be really valuable to you to set out for any decision-making process? I think that an extension of this is having some healthy communication norms and having some guidelines and some agreed upon principles. These can be tied with your values as well, about how you communicate and how you do things together. Arriving at any of these, arriving at fair process guidelines or healthy communication norms or any of the decisions that we talked about today can really be benefited by neutral facilitation. And what we mean by that is somebody who's a third party whose role is specifically to facilitate the conversation on behalf of everybody present. Family leadership is very valuable. And I think family leadership, whether that's, of a family group, of family governance, or sometimes on the board, incredibly important. And that can be a difficult place for family members to be, because they suddenly find themselves in a dual role, right? I'm serving on the family council. I'm also a family member. I have these relationships with people. And so facilitating that process as a family member can be pretty challenging. As you know, all the family dynamics come into play and can affect how that decision-making process goes. So we really do advocate for a neutral facilitator to ensure there's a fair process, to ensure you're following your guidelines, and doing so in a way that everybody has the the agreement that facilitator can keep the time, keep us on track, and make sure that we're following what we've agreed to. I think that this last piece is just really important to consider, because if you have a fair process and a good process for making these decisions, people can then go along with the decision maybe they don't agree with. And what I mean is that if people have had a chance to voice their opinion, they feel like the process has been fair, maybe at the end of the day they don't agree with the decision, but they can go along with it. And if you don't have this, you can really run into a problem where you make the decision, but people don't feel like it was fair, and so it's going to come back to bite you with a lack of alignment, people not following the decision, or creating some real challenges with the meeting after the meeting, simply because they feel like it hasn't been a fair process to get to that point. So all of these, again, think of how this applies to you and your family, but it is something that really cuts across small decisions, large decisions, and can be a way for the family to really develop some healthy ways of interacting.
Thank you, Josh. I think it's such an important place for us to wrap the core of our discussion is, you know, the importance is in how we make the decisions as much as the decisions that we make. And really good decisions require that kind of good process. So we're gonna go to Q&A here for a moment. Before we do, I'd like to issue a couple of invitations. We would love for you to consider participating in a survey that we are doing right now in partnership with the John L. Ward Center for Family Enterprises at Kellogg. This is a link that you will receive in your email after this program, where we're looking to understand what families' priorities are around education. So if you have, I think it's about 7 or 8 minutes to complete it. Any family member in a family enterprise over the age of 18 qualifies to complete it. We'd love for you to take a few minutes and help us learn more so that we can continue to bring things to you that will be most useful. And we will be sharing those findings a little later this year. And then the other thing is, I would invite you, if anything here has prompted a question for you and you're wondering, I want to learn more about share transitions, I want to learn more about fair process, pick a keyword that we may have talked about today. If you put it into the search box on our website, I can pretty much guarantee you will find more webinars, articles, books, and other resources that will speak to that topic. So we invite you to visit the website, learn more. We also have private educational events available for you and your family if you'd like to learn more about family governance, board governance, family directors essentials. All of those things are available to you, so please reach out and you'll get some more information about that as a follow-up. All right, so let's go to questions, and I would like to suggest we might stick a few minutes after the hour just to make sure that we can get to some of the themes that have popped up in the Q&A. I'll start with the first one. There are a few questions about vision, so I'm going to start back with Josh on this one. The questions circulate around the difference between an ownership vision and a company vision, maybe what belongs in each one, and how do those things connect?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'm sure David and Martha can add in on this. Where I've seen this work the best is a family-oriented vision is really related a little bit more to ownership. And are we, as a family, do we want to own this business long-term? What benefits might we want for the family and the community? Not really financial benefits, but what are the positive benefits of owning this legacy business? A vision for the business may be a little more operationally oriented, or it might be, we want to be the leading producer of safety products in the world. You know, it's simple, it's compelling, and it's something that some families see a real benefit to separating those out. Some families see those as one and the same, and they really combine those statements. I'm working with a client family now where they really like the format of having both something for the family and the business, because that works really well for them. Other families, again, in combining that, it just fits their culture. And it's something I think that no matter what you end up with, that everybody in the family should know, everybody in the business should know. And so it's really clear what that is and why you've done it that way.
So
I think another way of looking at it and framing your thinking around that is the family has its vision of what it wants to do, its impact it wants to have. But if let's say you hold multiple companies within the family enterprise, and one of them is in food service and another one is in manufacturing, they're going to have very different visions and purposes within those enterprises. And why are we in food service? What is our purpose there? What are we doing in manufacturing? What is the purpose there? So you can kind of peel back the onion and understand how you're fitting it to the right level, if you will.
Thank you both. I'm going to go on to the next one, and I'd actually open this to whomever might want to share examples, but there's a question around examples, team building examples for the rising generation to get started making decisions together. Where do you see next generation family members start their decision-making process, start learning to make decisions together?
That's an interesting one. I'll start. I think that there's a lot of different team building type exercises you can do, but I think that if you got the rising generation together, and let's assume it's before they're owners and you're doing a family retreat, right? But to have the rising generation come together and almost own the retreat itself as to what's it going to look like, what's the weekend, what are we going to be talking about, what's going to, you know, from business topics down to, you know, we're going to play croquet, we're going to go play golf, or we're going to go fishing. You know, just letting them come together. You know, often the younger generation is so used to kind of being in the back seat and letting the parents drive the ship. Well, maybe it's time to let the next generation jump in and try taking a shot at kind of managing and organizing and coming together on a simple thing to help prepare them for more complex, longer term decisions. The other piece I would encourage is, you know, often shareholder groups get together as a whole. I think one of the nicest things I've done with a family that I've been working with for a number of years is we just get the rising gen together, independent of the leading generation, and get them talking, like what's on their minds, because often what's on their minds is not what's on the minds of the leading generation. They are very different things at times.
Yeah, I've done something similar, David, where it's like, okay, rising gen, what questions do you have for the leading gen?
Yep.
And then vice versa, and then see where the conversation takes them as well. It can be super, super informative and helpful in opening up those dialogues.
Yep, definitely.
I'll add one more because I have run into this a lot, and that is, how do we drive next generation engagement? And I really say, let's ask them. Let's have the next generation involved in what that means for them in those decisions. Because if it's top down and the older generation deciding how the younger generation should be involved, it generally doesn't work as well as giving that next generation real responsibility in looking at ways they can be engaged. And that's a great way for them to start making decisions together.
Yeah. Yep.
Love it.
Perfect. I'm going to ask one more question before we conclude, and I'm just going to note for those of you who are still with us, as we close the program, you'll be invited to fill out a survey about today's program. We really do appreciate your comments and ratings there. It also invites you to let us know if you'd like us to follow up with you on a question that we didn't get to today's session, or if you'd like to contact David, Martha, or Josh directly. That's also an opportunity there. And again, you'll get everyone's contact information as a follow-up. So as we go to closing, this is a little bit of a stickier question, but it's a good one to get on the table. We talk about what happens when we're successful in making decisions. You know, how do families think about it when they're having difficulty coming to a decision together? What advice would you have for a family that maybe the participants see things in very different ways, or other tools or tricks that you might consider if they're having difficulty coming to consensus on an issue?
So I'll start with that. I think the first thing is to really understand where the other person's coming from. That we all have different perspectives, and that's okay. In a kind of judgment-free zone, so to speak, really, and even go so far as, you know, if Martha, Josh, and I are an ownership group and we're seeing things differently, for me to be able to articulate back to Josh what I think his perspective is, because we're imploring active listening here. And if Josh doesn't feel like I'm really hearing where he's coming from, he's not really going to be in a position to hear where I'm coming from. So to kind of do that around differing ownership goals, perspectives, it could be around Gripple, it could be about selling, it could be about a board member, you know, it could be about a lot of different things. It could be about a growth strategy or a product line. But if I need to understand where they're coming from first, and then they will be far more open to hearing where I'm coming from, and that can help create some positive energy to moving towards making a decision.
Yeah, I would add to that, it's something that our colleague Barb Dart has talked about a lot, and that's positions and interests. And somebody's position is, no, I don't want that. Well, why? What's your interest? And okay, my position is I don't want that. My interest is XYZ. And I think this fits with what David is saying, because you're taking it to the next layer of why people are advocating for a certain position. I would also, look at, does this decision need to be made right now? And sometimes the answer is yes, it does. And you're going to need to go through the difficulty of coming to that decision. Sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes taking a step back and saying, we're going to take a break, we're going to come together tomorrow or next week or next month or whatever it is. And in that meantime, you can do some exercises where people get at where are we hanging up? What means the most to me there? And come at it with a new, fresh look. I think we've all been involved in conversations where it just sort of grinds down into a stuck place. And so sometimes changing the channel in any of these ways that we're speaking about can lead to a more effective decision-making process.
Yep.
I think the last thing to add in that is each individual coming to the table with a sense of being willing to be vulnerable and a willingness to be curious. So it starts inside, as opposed to arriving with your dukes up that you're itching for a fight. You come in with an honest, or as best honest, positive regard for the other person. My brother David is my brother. He picked on me mercilessly when we were growing up, but he's still my brother. I come with curiosity and vulnerability and an openness to the conversation, and that it's hard. I'm not saying there's a magic wand, but it can be a very persuasive ingredient in those conversations.
I really like where we're leaving this conversation, because we started with ownership group and we really got to a place of how we can personally contribute to a positive outcome for the things that we want in our families. So I think that's a great place to close. David, Martha, Josh, thank you all for being here today and contributing.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Yes,
thank you everyone for attending. Please complete your survey if you have a few moments, and we hope that we'll see you at an upcoming conversation.